information that I'm going to share with you today is from this book by Dr. Peter Fenwick, which is The Art of Dying. Fascinating book. It's worth getting if you want to get it. And Peter Fenwick has been investigating near-death experiences for a long time, but he's a neuropsychiatrist, so he's looking at how the brain is operating with our psyche. And he's come to believe, from the many videos that I've watched, that near-death experiences are real, that people are actually having experiences that can't be explained. And as a neuropsychiatrist who has to study all the physiology involved, I find that really interesting. He said there are just things you just can't explain here. And he's quite convinced that we actually go on and our existence continues after we reach the point of death. And what his book is really about is, I guess, the outward symbols of the dying process. And I was really surprised because I discovered while looking at his work that it can start up to 2 years before we actually die, that things that manifest, but we may not sort of recognise it. And that dying is not the simple process that we might think it is. Well, not simple. I don't think that's simple. I think it's quite hard to die, but it's not just where the body stops, we stop breathing, we die, and then whatever happens after that possibly happens. There's this whole process surrounded in the loosening of our consciousness coming up to that dying point. And it's like there are our physical reality and our non-physical reality, if that's what you want to call it, they come to an intersection. But that intersection is not just one point, it's over a period of time in our physical existence. And it exists, it starts before we die, up to 2 years before we die, and it probably goes on for some time after we actually die until we go on to whatever it is that we go on to, in that journey to elsewhere. So it's a huge world of preparation, death, which I just didn't really fully grasp until I read his book. So it's really, I guess you could call them towards death experiences, which also includes near-death experiences too. And they can start with harbingers of death, and there's quite a few, but the most popular ones are experiences with birds, of all things. I think someone was mentioning birds before, weren't you? In other cultures in long ago times, there were what they call superstitions around birds and the types of birds that would come and gather around people who were dying. And curiously, while I was reading up about the birds as harbingers, I was hearing a lot of crows that was going on. And it got so loud. My office is out the front, and I was looking out over the road. I heard all these crows going, and as I looked up, I saw an ambulance go past while I was reading about this, and I thought, well, that's quite an intriguing, deathly coincidence, And there are a lot of deathly coincidences. We'll get on to that later. But the blackbird, the raven, the crow, etc., they've all been really significant in various cultures around the point of death, to the point where those particular animals will come up and actually knock on the windows of the dying person, and they will remain there until the person dies, and at the point that the person dies, they'll fly off and they'll never, they won't come back and do that again. So these are all really interesting things that happen. The other thing that I was looking at was the banshee, because that came from the Irish tradition. And the banshee is supposed to be a woman who comes during the night, and she wails near the dying person's point of birth, place of birth. And in those days, I'm imagining people didn't travel as far as they do these days. And the photos on the right are actually supposed to be real photos that were sent. I looked at a lot of photos, but this person said, it's an old photo. But the photos were taken by someone who had someone dying in the family at the time. So the banshee was another harbinger of death. And I wondered whether, a lot of superstitions, if you want to call it that, start from seeds of reality, So I wondered whether the idea of the banshee actually started from ghostly apparitions, which is what they actually appear like. And people saw ghostly apparitions of perhaps those who had already died coming to take the dying person's soul with them. Yeah. And of course there were other harbingers of death. And I'm sure a lot of you know this is the Mothman. And this being who appeared, and I thought, I just can't talk about harbingers of death without talking about the Mothman, going into my little sidetrack into my paranormal stuff. But because the Mothman appeared in quite a few places, not just at Point Pleasant over in, I forget where it was it Virginia or somewhere? But appeared, the Silver Bridge collapsed, yeah, that's right, just at Point Pleasant. This is 1967, and I think 43 people died in that. And the Mothman appeared for a week, I think, up to a week before the actual collapse of the bridge. Now, whether that being, whatever it was coming to warn people or trying to warn people, or whether it was there to collect people or to some other thing that we don't understand, I don't know. But it also appeared, this is supposedly a photo taken as well, but it also appeared in Germany in 1978 before a mine collapsed, and I think there were 50 men who died in that mining incident. It appeared for days before then, and whether it was there to warn or to collect people, because there is a lot of this soul collection and visitations by people who will come and before the dying person actually passes, and they will have these visitations, and sometimes they're seen by other relatives too, or people at the bedside. But here in this particular case, it was the same description, but they nicknamed it the Freiburg Shrieker because it made the sound of 50 men shrieking like they thought it was with the miners. Also appeared before Chernobyl too, which was really interesting. Also, you UFO people here, there was a large silver cigar-shaped object appeared at Chernobyl before it happened too. That was seen by quite a few people. So interesting, isn't it? Curious that just before death, or is about to happen, approaching death, that these experiences occur. The World Trade Center, there was also images, strange beings reported being seen by people before that happened too, which I didn't know about that one. And also the Minnesota Bridge collapse in 2007. This strange winged creature was seen, reported by people. So it's interesting, isn't it? Like, what the heck is that? But certainly a harbinger of something that's about to happen to do with death. And this is an interesting one too for me. The paranormal phenomena that happened around Jesus' crucifixion as reported, okay? That's all we can go by. But in this fresco you can see the two objects here that UFO people are interested in. And some people say this, various religious researchers say these are not UFOs, this represents the sun, that represents the moon. But I just thought the whole story, the historical story, if it's in fact accurate, around what happened around the time that Jesus died, where I think in the next slide I might have it. No, I don't. Okay, where there was an earthquake at the time he actually died. The temple curtain, I forget what they actually called it, which was not a curtain at all, it was actually 60 feet high and 4 inches thick. It just split into two, and that was a what they called a curtain, which was where certain people couldn't go further into the temple. That split in two. Rocks fell, What else happened? But there was a whole lot of paranormal phenomena that occurred around the death of that person. So I guess I'm just using that as an example for you to see that, these paranormal phenomena, they happen, and it's probably quite normal. And we have records of it in this record in history, but I'm sure if I actually went off and looked, there'd be probably other records too. The other interesting thing is that premonitions of death, of our own death, can occur up to 2 years before as well, which I find really fascinating. It's like there's some part of us that can recognise that something is about to happen, but we just don't know, we're not fully aware of it, but something reaches out and gives us that message. And one person, as you know, was Abraham Lincoln. He had a premonition of his own death, and I'll just read it here, that what's been written about that. It says, this is in his own words, "About 10 days ago I retired very late. I had been up waiting for important dispatches from the front. I could not have been long in bed when I fell into a slumber, for I was weary, and I soon began to dream. And there seemed to be a death-like stillness about me. And then I heard subdued sobs, as if a number of people were weeping. And I thought I left my bed and wandered downstairs. And there the silence was broken by the same pitiful sobbing, but the mourners were invisible. I went from room to room. No living person was in sight, but the same mournful sounds of distress met me as I passed along." I wonder if that was the banshee. "I saw the light in all the rooms. Every object was familiar to me, but where were all the people who were grieving as if their hearts would break? I was puzzled and alarmed, and what could be the meaning of this, determined to find the cause of a state of things so mysterious and so shocking. I kept on until I arrived at the east room, which I entered, and there I met with a sickening surprise. Before me was a catafalque, on which rested a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people gazing mournfully upon the corpse, and whose face was covered, and others weeping pitifully. 'Who is dead in the White House?' I demanded of one of the soldiers, and the president was his answer, and he was killed by an assassin." And then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which woke me from my dream, and I slept no more that night, and although it was only a dream, I have been strangely annoyed by it ever since. So apparently he went on and told his wife about that dream, and she was very worried about him, of course, and he said, "Oh, it was only a dream, it's only a dream." Of course, then, he was assassinated. So it's that was an interesting dream, I think, and I have heard of people, we know that people can have precognitive dreams, but to have precognitive dreams of your own death is curious. Another person who had a premonition of death was Mark Twain. He had a premonition about his brother dying, and he said he had a dream about his brother's corpse laying in a metal coffin in his sister's living room. And weeks later, his brother died in a massive explosion on a riverboat, which is curious. Now, this is another collection too by a woman called Bonnie McEneaney, and she's written this book, Messages, Signs, Visits and Premonitions from Loved Ones Lost on 9/11. And of course, there'd be a lot of happening, I think, in so many ways in our material reality and our invisible world around so many people dying at once. Such a collective effort, I think, of mobilization by forces, to carry those souls, I guess, and help them transition. So I've just got and she talks about premonitions and signs. So I'm just going to play a clip of hers, which is the next one, talking about her experiences.
Before 9/11, I was a corporate executive. I was raised a Christian, and I am a Christian. But I have to say I really was somewhat skeptical about the notion of more than this, life after death. My name is Bonnie McEneaney, and this is my new book, Messages, Signs, Visits, and Premonitions from Loved Ones Lost on 9/11. met my husband at Cornell University when I went up there for my first year of graduate studies. He was an incredible guy. He was very altruistic. He would have given you the shirt off his back. And he truly loved the men that he worked with on the 105th floor of the North Tower. Our last major conversation was on September 9th. We were watching the World War II miniseries Band of Brothers. It was the premiere episode. And then he said, I want you to know that I'm prepared for my death and I can handle it now. And that precipitated a very emotional exchange between the two of us. I didn't think he was having premonitions. I thought he was falling into some clinical depression. And I didn't realize that he truly had a sense of foreboding, that, he knew he was going to die. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. And, I've had years now to reflect on all of that. Can't explain it. I do know that many other people also, which is what I came to learn, had a similar kind of sense of something. Their personalities were changing. They were becoming very low. They were taking out life insurance. They were taking care of loose ends. It was the morning of September 13th, and there were many, many wonderful people still in my house making phone calls, making lists of next steps, so that we could turn over every stone. And I became extremely frustrated with just no answers. And I was distraught, of course. And, my kids, I have 4 little kids. I went out my front door, and I don't know what possessed me, but I just yelled out as loud as I could. It was almost as if it was someone else's voice. Eamon, just tell us where you are. And I thought, this is ridiculous. It was a very still day, not a breeze, nothing, just still and dry. And within about 15 to 20 seconds, I heard a rustling sound above in one of the trees that frames the entrance to my driveway. And I looked up and I saw the branches start to sway. And then all of a sudden, this wind emerged from the tree and came around like a river in a way and undulated around and, other trees in my front yard and blew them. And the way I describe it, this river of wind, it came and I was wearing a skirt. It sort of whimsically lifted my skirt and let it fall, and then it stopped. And I stood there. And there was no more breeze, no more wind, nothing was blowing, leaves were all status quo. And then I realized that it was the answer to the question that I had asked. And I certainly don't know, was it my husband? Was it God? Was it some other spiritual force? I don't know, of course. I mean, there was no identity associated with it, but I did know it was confirming that he was gone. I'd already heard a number of the spiritual stories other people had had, because I knew so many people who were talking together. People had signs from their loved ones that were unmistakably their loved one communicating to them. Many people had visitations, after-death visitations. The long and the short of it, though, is that the degree to which the emotional healing and growth of the people who were traumatized have been helped by these experiences, to me, is what faith is all about. February of 2002, it was an extremely cold day in New England, and I was at a small 9/11 family meeting that was going on in a neighboring town. And I'd been there for about a half hour, and there was a knock at the door. And I was closest to the door, so I got up and I opened it, and standing there, I'll never forget what I saw, was one of the heads of our local police department and my pastor. And one of them, I don't know which one, whispered, "They found your husband's remains in downtown Manhattan." And the minister said, "I'm going to drive you home." We bundled up, went outside, got in the car, we started to drive, and I was just sort of not thinking about anything except this, and just not aware of anything going on around me. And suddenly, when I became more alert, I realized that we were in my town, and he was taking this right-hand turn. And I saw that he was going into our local cemetery. And I thought, what's he doing? So I said, what are you doing? And he said, you're going to have to start thinking about this now. You're going to have to start thinking about what you're going to do with the remains. This is a beautiful cemetery. I just want you to see it. Now, a little bit of background before I tell you what happened. My dad, when he was alive, had a home in Florida on the water. And every morning this great blue heron would parade around in front by the water's edge. And they developed a sort of friendship, if you will. One Christmas, Eamon and I, my husband and I, bought him a glass replica of the heron, and it really became this point of connection between the three of us. So fast forward, February, we're just going into the cemetery, piles of snow on either side of the car, this chill in the air, and off from my peripheral vision I see this shadow, and I look up and this giant wingspan, and this bird lands in front of our car. And I realized that I can't even explain the emotion. It was a great blue heron. Clearly it was a spiritual sign of comfort of some sort. And again, was it God? Was it my husband? Was it something else? I don't know. But I know what it was intended to do. It was intended to give me a message of comfort and support. Because I was sort of starting to hear more and more of these stories, I thought, you know what? These stories, again, have been so helpful to people. These signs of an afterlife, the connection with the loved one even after they pass. And I thought about that, and I thought, when a person has a true spiritual experience, they are allowed now to look at the situation they're in from a different perspective. And it was a very healthy transition for those that I sort of observed, including myself. And so I thought, I'm going to collect these stories and I'm going to try to write a book and put them together. Just so encouraging. I don't think people should be afraid to talk about it. It's okay. It's a wonderful thing, especially if it's helped you get through whatever circumstances you've been confronted with.
And her book is full of these deathly coincidences, like her story with that blue heron, and that the people who died in 9/11, how they changed their behaviour before they actually died. They, like she said, took out insurance policies. They were saying things like if they had events that they were supposed to go to, like a wedding or a christening or something, they'd say, I can't see myself being there, I just won't be there. Those sorts of things. I've got a couple of examples here. One was where was it? She said, McEneaney tells a Wells Crowther, a 24-year-old trader who died in the attack, and his friends and family noticed that he began acting very strangely during the summer of 2001. And he was described by friends and family as being depressed and restless, and on Labour Day his mother remembered that he seemed very melancholy, and none of this was characteristic of him at all. Another case was a woman named Lorraine. She had a dream a week or so before 9/11 that seemed to suggest that her husband Bill would meet with a tragedy. She didn't tell her husband about the dream, but she also observed that Bill's behaviour and attitude the weekend before 9/11 was very different from what they normally were. So it was, I guess, and then there's lots of them. That's just a couple of examples. But, when it's like somehow at least some people, perhaps not people who are going to die in a car accident or, unexpectedly, I don't know. But even, sometimes people become aware of something, and they may not even become consciously aware. It may affect them unconsciously, but there is something about to happen that's imminent. There was also, in 2007, there was a story which tells of a Minnesota man called Fidel who died accidentally on his job. But a week before his death, he told his niece to pray really hard because something is approaching. And the day before his death, he told his wife that he loved her and would continue to love her after his death. And when his wife asked why he was saying that, he replied that he didn't know. He didn't know. So again, something's happening. And I had an experience like that with my grandfather actually before he died. I invited my whole family over for Christmas, Christmas just before he died. And when we left, my grandfather I knew he loved me, but he never physically demonstrated that at all. He'd never come up and give me a hug or anything like that, or say I love you, nothing like that. I guess that, that generation possibly didn't do that, I don't know. But that Christmas, when he was leaving, he came up to me and he gave me this big bear hug, and he said, "Thank you so much for having me here at Christmas dinner with everybody." And I think it was 3 days later he was dead. It was just out of character. So, it was almost like it was a sign to me that he knew something was about to happen. This is interesting because it's where people can be dying, but this is where they can tap into that intersection of the two realities, or multiple realities perhaps, in the material reality, but also see other visions, other, I guess you'd say, scenescapes. I guess you could say it like that. So they can report seeing the roof of the house disappearing, and they can see into another world full of light, or they can see into a darkness too. It doesn't have to be light, but it's like the two visions are overlapping, which is interesting. And I read one story of someone who went to visit their mother, and the mother had been quite ill, but this particular day she sat up and she was having this 4-hour conversation with a dead brother, and the daughter was there visiting her, and she was the mother had asked the daughter to come over, and she introduced her daughter to the dead brother, who the daughter couldn't see, but they had this 3-way conversation that went on for 4 hours with a dead person and a dying person and a living person, which I thought was very interesting. Also, they can report with, reaching out to people who've come to greet them. And I don't know if any of you have had that experience, not you, but people you know who've had that experience. And they can start talking about going on a journey. And the carers, the professional carers, medical staff, talking about these things is a big taboo, particularly with doctors and nurses. But even, Dr. Peter Fenwick, he found that when he went and interviewed carers in hospices, even they were quite hesitant to talk about these experiences too. So it sort of sets it up as, that's why I think we don't hear more about these things, because the point where it actually happens, unless it's happening at someone's home or with a relative who goes to visit someone in hospital, you generally don't hear about these things. There's a lot of coincidences around death, and a lot of them actually happen with animals, believe it or not. And one of them was with the Titanic victim Patrick O'Connell, and it was about a dog that he was attached to. And back in Patrick's home village in Cork, County Cork, reportedly the dog that he was attached to was heard to howl piercingly at the time the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic, and Patrick would have died. And this is where the timing of things gets really interesting. There are other experiences that happen too, where things like music will stop playing at the time the person dies. Electrical equipment will stop working at the time the person dies, those sorts of things too. And Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, he says that nothing happens by chance, and events happening at the same time do so for a reason and have a profound linkage. So I guess in that example, like I quoted to you before with Marie, where we're connected somewhere there, but we don't know why. But I said, well, we'll find out why when you get here. But because he wrote that book about synchronicity too, and why. And yes, the other thing is synchronicities can increase too, and they can increase when, I know for a fact that people who report close encounters with ETs, the synchronicity in their life heightens as well. People who have near-death experiences, the synchronicity for them heightens as well. And why that is, I don't really fully understand that, but it does. 2/3 accounts of death contact occur during the sleep-wake state, and I wonder if, and it's often when people have are waking up more than when they're going to sleep, but as they become conscious, they'll see someone in the room with them. And I find that really curious too, whether it's related to our states of consciousness at that particular time or not. I think it could possibly be. And when people have deathbed visions, it can happen around those times too. And this was a survey that was done in 1971, and I thought it was curious because I expected that because it's looking at people who sense the presence of people who've passed over, or they see the deceased, they hear the deceased, they speak to the deceased, or they're touched by the deceased after they've lost that person in their life. And I looked at the statistics because I thought mainly it would be females, or mostly females, who were more sensitive to these particular things, but it's actually not, because 43.9% of males, as opposed to 37.9% females, actually sensed a presence of their departed loved one, which is curious. I thought it would be the females would be higher. And the same with seeing the deceased, more males than females, just slightly, but more. And yet we're hearing the deceased, there's more females than males, and speaking to the deceased, more males than females, and touched by the deceased, more females than males. Now, I don't know how to explain that, and then the survey results, as I was reading, they didn't explain it either, but I just found it really curious. And to explain this, there was a woman called Gertrude Schmeidler. Anyway, she coined the term the sheep goat effect. Here we are. She was a professor of psychology at the City University of New York, and she set up a questionnaire to explore students' beliefs about psi. So she used the term sheep to refer to those who were confident about the reality of psi, and goats for those who doubted its existence or its pertinence in the context of the test. And after the questionnaire, she gave the students a classic psi test with ESP cards, in which they tried to guess sequences of target cards. And then Schmeidler compared the results of the psi test and those of the questionnaire. The remarkable conclusion was that sheep had a significant deviation above chance, while goats were significantly below it. She goes on to say, to draw the conclusion that the goats represent the people with the more left brain thinking, the skeptical types as well, and they will be less likely to have unusual experiences. And the people who are more open and I guess maybe sensitive, but more open-minded about these things, they were more likely to have these experiences too. So draw from conclusions from that as you will. Is it accurate? Possibly. I do think that our beliefs drive our perceptions. I think I've read enough research on that to know that's probably true. And if you don't believe in things, you'll never see it, I suppose. But then again, if you look at the skeptics who are looking at, say, I'm saying this because I used to listen to the Paranormal Panel show. We had Vice President was on there for a while, and he used to be a skeptic, and he was the UFO person. There'd be a psychic as well. But the skeptic always tried to explain it away, to explain things as misinterpretations. So maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But anyway, there you go. That's the sheep-goat effect. Around the time of death, as I'm sure you know, the people can report visions of light and mist. And it's not just by the people who are dying, but it can also be about the people who are visiting too. And things in the room can change as well. So they can see heat haze, like mirage hazes. They can see this bright light that'll appear in the room point of the person dying as well. And I think maybe that's sort of like a manifestation of when two worlds collide, perhaps, when these two realities, you know, that intersection becomes real, becomes closer to that approaching point. And someone described it as, I've seen a beautiful light and I was going towards it. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful, I really had to fight to come back. And another story is, approximately 2 weeks before my father's death, he would tell me about various family members who had died, who he said had been to visit him, particularly my mother and brother who had died years before. He would say there was a bright light, and then he would see them and he could talk to them. And I sat with the family for a while when he called me. I went to his room and he said, "Look at that bright light," apparently on the wall opposite his bed. He was staring at it and sitting up. "Look at that lovely light, isn't it beautiful?" But I could see nothing.
I don't have the answer to that. Is there something else I can help you with?
Talk about deathly coincidences. I hope that's not a harbinger of anything. Good grief. Didn't that happen last time? I think the phone went off by itself. That's weird. Okay. Oh dear.
The voice from beyond.
Yeah. So I do think it's a possibility where that this white light has something to do with crossing dimensions somehow. To do with the mechanics of physics, perhaps. I don't know. I sort of think that these sort of manifestations can actually be explained. It's just that we don't have the science yet to understand it and explain it in words that we understand. But I think that's a possibility. There was another story too. This was actually a shared experience. And this person said, "Suddenly I was aware that her father was standing at the end of the bed. My mother was staring at him too, and her face was lit up with joy. It was then that I saw that her face appeared to be glowing with a gold light. The light began to leave through the top of her head and go towards the ceiling. Looking back to my mother's face, I saw that she was gone." And another one, in the middle of the night, I woke up to hear Mum screaming that Dad had taken ill, so I called the emergency doctor. Dad had suffered a major stroke and died the following evening. I was asleep at home when he died in the hospital, and I felt an electric shock and saw a cord snapping, which woke me up to find that my bedroom was lit up in what I can only describe as an electric blue light. Within a minute of waking and seeing this, the phone rang and a nurse told me that my father had just died. Curious, eh? Very curious. The departing souls. This is where they can see the heat haze, experience the gentle breeze, see mist. The people themselves can report it, the dying people, but also people who are in the room with them too can see these types of things. The Dalai Lama talks about stages of dissolution, which I thought I might share with you because I hadn't come across this before. And he talks about the first stage when people are dying, and this is related to like the transition from one dimension, to another one. The dying feel weak and powerless, but they have a mental image of a bluish appearance, as in a mirage. The next stage is not conscious of pleasure, pain, feelings, yet they have a mental image of something smoke-like. Next stage is no longer remembering things, but the mental image is like fireflies, burning red sparks with puffs of smoke. Then no understanding of worldly activities, no breath, no sensations, but a mental state like a sputtering lamp about to go out. Then you have the disintegration of consciousness, dawning of extreme clarity and acuity, as well as a light with a white aspect, like a night sky pervaded by moonlight. And then the next stage is the mental state dawns with a red-orange appearance. It's empty, but it's clearer. And then you have the great empty, which is the empty black appearance but intensely alive. And then awaken into the clear light of death and the basic truth body is formed. And then enter the bardo of death and meet figures. So I think through all that explanation we can see examples of these towards death experiences that people talk about, where you can have flickering lights, you can have these hazes, you can meet figures as people report in near-death experiences too. That's pretty interesting. I hadn't read that sort of stuff before. I wondered if he remembered it from his reincarnation, death and reincarnation, from his past many deaths. So for me, I think that life and death are journeys in consciousness, and for me, it's from what I sort of gathered after reading Peter Fenwick's book in particular, but other stories as well, is that there's this whole process that goes on around our birth as well as our death. And it's such a complicated, intricate, complex, but rich and highly, very difficult to understand experience. But the point is that it's not just about us, closing our eyes and just disappearing. There's a whole process around that and the intersection of the dimensions as well, as they connect, as we draw closer to that point of departure, and we connect with both worlds, and then we go on. And I think what happens from there, as I've read from many other people too, is that, and people have near-death experiences as well, is that after death, which can go on for quite a few hours, our brain doesn't actually stop, that we then become quite refined, and we, with that stages of dissolution, after that is we become that refined energy, and then we go back to the universal energy and reintegrate it into that. And who knows what goes on from there exactly. I don't, but I'm sure some people might understand more than I have, especially people who've had near-death experiences, which I did, but I didn't have a full-blown, one experience like that.